very lovely stewardess looking after me. I was all over the place.
For over 2 decades, Earl Charles Spencer guarded the gates of Althorpe in absolute silence. Alone, he carried a secret that would have shattered the British monarchy. But now, he has finally broken his silence. The brother of the world's most famous princess has exposed a devastating hidden truth that leaves Buckingham Palace reeling. It is not just a story of childhood trauma. It is a raw confession of sibling betrayal, a fatal refusal, and a modern rebellion that is tearing the House of Windsor apart once again. What did Charles Spencer do when his sister begged him for help? And why is he now standing with Prince Harry? The silence is over, and the truth is absolutely terrifying. The sanctuary denied. The summer wind of 1993 carried a desperate cry through the locked stone gates of the Althorpe estate. Inside the great house, Charles Spencer held a letter in his hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to his sister, Princess Diana. But this was not the global icon writing. This was a terrified, hunted woman. She was begging her brother for a single favor. She wanted to move into Garden Cottage, a quiet and secure home on their childhood estate. She needed a sanctuary. The wiretaps in London were closing in. The paparazzi were outside her door day and night. She was losing her mind. She felt that the walls of Kensington Palace were recording her every breath. She knew that her staff were spying on her, and that she was completely defenseless against the machinery of the crown. But Charles Spencer did something unthinkable. He folded the letter, picked up his cold pen, and wrote a defensive, calculated refusal. He locked the gates against his own sister. He did not offer her a room or a cottage. He simply shut her out. Why did the one man Diana trusted to protect her from the Windsor machine turn her away in her darkest hour? And what was the hidden, tragic excuse he used to justify leaving her fatally exposed? To the public, Charles Spencer was Diana's ultimate champion. His fierce, protective eulogy at Westminster Abbey in 1997 made him the family protector. He stood before the world and openly attacked the royal family for their coldness. He accused the media of having blood on their hands. But behind that righteous fury, a dark, consuming guilt was eating him alive. He knew what the public did not. And he knew that by denying her a home at Althorpe, he had forced her back into the treacherous streets of London. He had left her vulnerable to the predatory forces that would eventually claim her life in Paris. The righteous anger he unleashed on the world was a shield. It was a desperate attempt to cover up the quiet, devastating knowledge that he had turned his back on her when she begged for his help. The truth of his refusal is far more complex than simple sibling coldness. Charles was terrified. He was a young father, desperately trying to raise his own young children away from the blinding glare of the media. He had only recently inherited the massive ancestral estate of Althorpe, and it came with its crushing financial debts and the overwhelming responsibility of maintaining a dynasty. In his letter to Diana, he argued that her presence at Althorpe would destroy his family's peace. He claimed that her arrival would bring an army of photographers to his quiet doorstep. Charles believed that the local roads would be blocked by satellite trucks and that the fields would be trampled by reporters. He knew that his children would be subjected to the same invasive torment that had ruined Diana's life. He argued that the peaceful estate could not provide the heavy military-grade security she required to survive, and pointed out that the local police force was small and ill-equipped to handle the global circus that followed her everywhere. He told his sister that she was simply too famous to be saved. He told her that her fame was a threat to his own children. It was a rational decision made by a practical man. But in the high-stakes world of royal survival, practical decisions can be fatal. Diana was devastated by the rejection. To her, it was the ultimate betrayal, the one place she believed she was safe. It was the home of her ancestors where she had run through the grass as a child and had shut its doors to her. She realized that even her own blood was subject to the fear of her shadow. She felt entirely alone, abandoned by the court, divorced from her husband, and shut out by her brother. She was cast back into the wilderness of London, forced to rely on private security and transient arrangements. She was moving closer and closer to the orbit of the Al Fayed family. But this tragic refusal was not just a single act of selfishness. It was the direct result of a deep psychological conditioning. To understand why Charles Spencer turned his back on his sister when she needed him most, we have to look at the terrifying environment that shaped them both. and take a look at a dark, unpolished secret buried deep in Charles's own childhood. We must examine how the British aristocracy prepares its young to survive by destroying their ability to feel, a secret that involves a brutal headmaster, late-night lessons, and systematic abuse, one that stripped him of his empathy long before he ever had to save his sister. What was the horrific truth behind his boarding school exile? And how did a simple spelling error lead to a punishment he would carry on his skin for decades? The sadist in the headmaster's study. In 1972, a young Charles Spencer was delivered to these grand stone steps. He was only 8 years old. He was already carrying a deep, quiet wound. His parents had just gone through a brutal, highly publicized divorce. The custody battle had been vicious. It played out in the national newspapers. His mother had left the family home, leaving the children behind. In the aristocratic circles of England, there was no room for comforting a grieving child. There were no warm embraces, quiet conversations, and permission to cry. Instead, the solution was banishment. Charles was packed off to boarding school, a place where he was expected to learn the stiff, cold reserve of his social class. He was expected to grow up, stiffen his lip, and forget his mother. But what he encountered behind those heavy wooden doors was not discipline. It was a systematic house of horrors. At the center of this terrifying world stood the headmaster, a man named Jack Porch. To the wealthy parents who visited on weekends, Jack Porch was a warm, jovial, and reassuring gentleman. He wore tweed jackets, wrote glowing term reports, and smiled reassuringly as he accepted their massive tuition payments. But the moment the parents drove away, the mask slipped. His warm smile dissolved into a cold, terrifying stare. He was a master of psychological and physical terror. He ruled the school through fear. He was dividing the young boys, mocking those he deemed weak, and encouraging aggressive free-for-alls that left the children constantly on edge. He created an environment of perpetual anxiety, showing vulnerability. But it was during the quiet hours of the night that his cruelty took on its most sinister form. What was the dark secret behind the headmaster's late-night extra lessons? And how did a simple spelling error lead to a punishment that Charles would carry on his skin for decades? The headmaster targeted the most vulnerable boys in the school, particularly those from broken homes who were desperate for a father figure. He knew who was lonely, he knew who missed their mother, and he used religion as a weapon. He spent hours delivering long, terrifying sermons about sin, damnation, and filial duty. He would tell a boy struggling with his parents' divorce that he was outraged by the family split, and then convince the child that their parents' separation was a moral failing and that they were tarnished by it. Then, he would deliver a terrifying decree. He told the child that he should consider him, the headmaster, as his new father. He demanded absolute obedience and absolute devotion. This psychological grooming set the stage for what Jack Porch called his Sunday night confessions and extra lessons. In the dead of night, boys would be summoned to the headmaster's private study. The long walk down the dark, creaking hallway was a journey of absolute terror. In that quiet room, the headmaster kept two distinct wooden canes. He had given them names. He called them the Flick and the Switch. The young, terrified boys were forced to strip and stand before him, completely exposed. They were subjected to intense, high-pressure oral dictations and spelling tests. The headmaster would read a passage rapidly, demanding immediate, flawless spelling of complex, archaic words. If a boy stumbled, froze under the pressure, or made a single nervous spelling error, the response was immediate physical savagery. The headmaster would pull the young child over his knee and unleash the canes. He beat the boys with a cold, calculated fury. Charles Spencer would later recount the visceral, haunting detail of those awful mornings. The physical trauma was so severe that when the boys got dressed the next day, their dried blood would stick to their cotton underpants. The simple act of removing their clothes at night meant ripping open the wounds all over again. They had to peel the fabric away from their flesh in the dark, silent dormitories. They ended up fighting back the urge to scream because crying out would only bring another beating. It was a punishment designed to strip a young boy of his dignity, safety, and empathy. For 5 long years, Charles Spencer lived in this environment of constant terror. He learned that the adult world was inherently hostile. He saw that those in authority were predators, and that love was always linked to pain. To survive, he had to build an impenetrable wall around his emotions. He had to learn how to completely disappear inside his own body. He learned to suppress his pain, ignore the cries of others, and to maintain a code of absolute defensive silence. He realized that showing pity for another boy being beaten would only draw the headmaster's wrath toward himself. This systematic conditioning is the key to unlocking the mystery of Althorp. When Charles Spencer grew into a man, he carried this hardened emotional armor with him. It was the same upper-class conditioning that shaped generations of royal men, including King Charles III. It was a system that taught young boys that showing vulnerability was a fatal mistake. So, when Princess Diana stood at his locked gates in 1993, begging for a safe sanctuary, Charles did not see a sister in agony. His conditioned mind did not react with human warmth. Instead, he saw a threat to his carefully constructed peace. He saw an intrusion into his ordered world. He reacted with the cold, defensive pragmatism that had been beaten into him at Maidwell Hall. He shut her out because the capacity for simple human empathy had been systematically destroyed inside him decades before. He had been trained to lock the gates of his heart to survive. And when the time came, he locked the gates of his estate. But this cycle of manipulation and betrayal did not end in the schoolyard. The psychological scars of Charles Spencer's childhood left him uniquely vulnerable to a new kind of predator. Years later, a highly sophisticated machine would weaponize his past trauma to gain access to his sister. He was setting off a chain reaction that would lead Princess Diana straight into a deadly trap. What shocking direct connection did Charles realize years later between his childhood headmaster's manipulative lies and the deceitful methods the British Broadcasting Corporation used to target Diana in 1995? The fatal parallel. The architectural blueprints of manipulation rarely change. The same patterns used to break a defenseless child in a headmaster's study can be scaled up to corner a princess on the global stage. By the mid-1990s, Charles Spencer believed he had escaped the shadows of Maidwell Hall. He was the head of his ancestral estate, a peer of the realm and a protector of his family's name. But the psychological programming of his youth had left a lingering vulnerability. He had been trained to fear institutional power, to look for hidden traps, and to believe that those in authority were constantly plotting in secret. He was hyper-vigilant, always waiting for the next blow to fall and believing that his security was an illusion. In 1995, a television reporter named Martin Bashir walked into Charles Spencer's life. He was carrying a leather briefcase and a collection of documents that would change British history forever. To the outside world, the interview that followed would become the most explosive broadcast of the 20th century. It was the moment Princess Diana sat before the cameras and declared there were 3 people in her marriage. It was the moment she shattered the image of the royal family forever. But the path to that interview did not start with Diana. It started with Charles. Martin Bashir knew that to reach the princess, he had to bypass her inner circle. He had to get to the one man who had access to her private thoughts, the brother she trusted. He targeted Charles Spencer with surgical precision. Martin used a playbook that was chillingly familiar to anyone who had survived Maidwell Hall. Bashir presented Charles with a series of bank statements. They appeared to show that senior royal courtiers and security staff were being paid large sums of money gotten by foreign intelligence services to spy on the Spencer family. The documents were elaborate. They looked completely official, detailing accounts, dates, and transactions. They suggested that Charles's own head of security was selling family secrets, and his phones were tapped by the intelligence services. It was clear that a systematic conspiracy was underway to destroy the Spencers. In reality, the bank statements were complete and utter forgeries. They were completely fabricated by a graphic designer on Bashir's instructions. But to Charles Spencer, looking at those papers, a lifetime of suppressed trauma erupted. The paranoia was immediate. It was the same feeling he had as an 8-year-old boy at Maidwell Hall. The feeling that he was surrounded by enemies and that his private spaces were violated. He felt that there was no one left to trust and believed the institution was coming for him, just as it had come for him in 1972. Charles reacted exactly as he had been conditioned to react. He sought to protect his sister from what he believed was a massive institutional conspiracy. He wanted to pull her close, warn her, and fight back against the faceless enemies he believed were closing in. Charles arranged a private meeting. He brought Martin Bashir and Princess Diana together in a London apartment. It was the fatal catalyst. Bashir took the psychological warfare he had used on Charles and turned it directly onto Diana. He told her she was being watched and that her car was tracked. Her phones were bugged, and her closest friends were betraying her to the security services. For a woman already living under immense psychological pressure, struggling with the end of her marriage and the isolation of royal life, this was the final blow. Bashir isolated her from everyone who could have saved her. He convinced her that her staff, friends, and even her family were part of the conspiracy. He left her with only one option: to tell her story before her enemies destroyed her. This was the shocking, direct connection Charles Spencer would only realize decades later. His childhood headmaster, Jack Porch, had used manufactured fear and psychological isolation to make vulnerable boys completely dependent on his mercy. He had convinced them that their homes were broken, told them that they were unloved and that only he could protect them. Martin Bashir and the British Broadcasting Corporation had used the exact same method. They manufactured a conspiracy, isolated Diana from her family and her trusted advisors. She was pushed into a public war that she could not win. The institution Charles had been trained to fear had used his own hands to spring the trap on his sister. He had been the gateway through which the predator entered. The guilt of that introduction would haunt Charles Spencer forever. He had turned her away from Althorpe in 1993, and then, in 1995, he had accidentally delivered her straight into the hands of her exploiters. But the ultimate clash between the Earl and the royal establishment was yet to come. It would unfold in a high-tension telephone call. Charles received the call on the eve of his sister's funeral, revealing a cold palace deception that remains a painful scar to this day. What was the specific cruel lie told to Earl Spencer by a high-ranking royal courtier on the phone just hours before the funeral? And how did it change the course of that historic day? The horrifying half hour. The days following the late August tragedy of 1997 were a blur of grief, fury, and administrative coldness. The world was weeping. But inside the palace walls, the calculators were at work. Inside Kensington Palace, Princess Diana's body lay in state, while behind the scenes, a bitter war of attrition was being fought. On one side stood the royal family, who was desperately trying to manage a public relations crisis that threatened the very survival of the monarchy. They were accused of being cold, silent, and having abandoned the people's princess. On the other stood Earl Charles Spencer, consumed by grief and a deep defensive rage. He was determined that the institution that had stripped his sister of her title in life would not exploit her in death. As the funeral plans began to finalize, the tension centered on a single, agonizing question. Who would walk behind the gun carriage carrying Princess Diana's coffin? The palace organizers wanted a show of unified royal stoicism. They wanted the public to see the royal family standing strong. They flanked the young princes, William and Harry, who were only 15 and 12 years old at the time. To the courtiers, the image of the young boys walking behind their mother's coffin would evoke immense public sympathy. It would quiet the rising tide of anger against the crown and shared grief. But to Charles Spencer, the proposal was an act of pure institutional cruelty. He was horrified, and he saw it as a cynical attempt to use two grieving children as a human shield for the monarchy's reputation. Charles stood his ground. He called the palace coordinators and made his position clear. He argued that it was barbaric to force two grieving children to walk a mile through the streets of London. He hated the fact that they were paraded before millions of television cameras and a weeping crowd of 1 million people. Charles told them that Diana would have been absolutely outraged by the suggestion. She had spent her life trying to protect her boys from the relentless glare of the media, and now the palace wanted to parade them behind her corpse. He insisted that he, and he alone, should walk behind the coffin as the family representative. He wanted to spare the boys from a public trauma they would carry for the rest of their lives. The telephone lines between Althorpe and Buckingham Palace burned with a furious, unyielding tension. Charles shouted down the phone, refusing to back down. And for a brief moment, it appeared he had successfully protected his nephews from the palace machinery. But then, just hours before the funeral was set to begin, Charles received a phone call from a high-ranking royal courtier that would break his resolve. The courtier's voice was calm, authoritative, and completely steady. He told the Earl that his protests were noted, but the situation had changed. He claimed that Prince William and Prince Harry had been consulted privately, away from their father, Both boys had personally and passionately demanded to walk behind their mother's coffin. The courtier explained that the boys felt it was their duty. They wanted to honor their mother in this public way, and they would be deeply hurt if they were denied the chance to make this final journey with her. He made it sound as though Charles's interference was actually hurting the children. Faced with this information, Charles Spencer yielded. He could not stand in the way of his nephew's wishes. If the boys truly wanted to walk, he had no right to stop them. He agreed to walk beside them. He joined Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and the young boys on that long, agonizing march from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey. He walked through a wall of sound and the weeping of the crowds. Charles survived the clicking of thousands of cameras and the heavy rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves. It was an experience he would later describe as the most horrifying half-hour of his entire life. He felt the cold, crushing weight of the institution pushing down on those two little boys beside him. He saw them staring straight ahead, their tiny shoulders tense, forced to perform their grief for a global audience. But the horror of that walk was multiplied tenfold years later when the truth finally emerged. The courtier had lied. Prince William and Prince Harry had never demanded to walk. They had never been given a choice. They had been told by the palace staff that it was expected of them, that it was their duty to the crown, and that they had no alternative. The courtier had used a calculated falsehood to manipulate Charles into compliance. He made sure the palace got the exact public image they wanted at the cost of two children's emotional well-being. It was a betrayal that strengthened Charles Spencer's lifelong distrust of the palace courtiers. It showed him that the Windsor machine would sacrifice anything, even the mental health of its own children, to protect its image. It was this same protective anger, born on the streets of London in 1997, that would drive Charles to make a dramatic public stand decades later. He would step forward to support Prince Harry during his modern-day exile, defying the silent rules of his social class to send a clear message to the king. Why did Earl Spencer make the shocking decision to publicly stand beside Prince Harry at St. Paul's Cathedral in 2024 while the rest of the royal family turned their backs? And what private message did this alliance send to King Charles? The Windsor Rebellion. The grand stone steps of St. Paul's Cathedral have witnessed centuries of royal history. But on a bright spring afternoon in May of 2024, they became the stage for a silent, aristocratic revolution. Inside, a service was being held to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Invictus Games. It was the international sporting event Prince Harry had founded for wounded veterans. Outside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Prince Harry had returned to his homeland, but he was completely alone. The royal family had made their position clear. King Charles and Prince William had pointedly refused to attend. They had scheduled a garden party at Buckingham Palace at the exact same hour, and they made sure every senior member of the family was occupied elsewhere. It was a public, calculated snub designed to isolate Harry, signaling to the world that he was no longer part of the royal circle. The message from the palace was unambiguous. Harry was on his own, a rogue prince operating without the blessing of the crown. The courtiers wanted the steps of St. Paul's to look empty. They presented an image of a forgotten son. But as Prince Harry's car pulled up to the cathedral, a figure emerged from the crowd to meet him on the steps. It was not a royal courtier, nor was it a political figure. It was his uncle, Earl Charles Spencer. He was joined by his sister, Lady Jane Fellows. They did not slip in through a side door. They walked up the main steps, standing shoulder to shoulder with Harry before the flashing cameras of the global media. To the public, it was an incredibly moving show of family support. But to those who understand the unspoken language of the British aristocracy, it was a devastating act of defiance. Charles Spencer was breaking the golden rule of his class. He was choosing sibling loyalty over institutional compliance. By standing with Harry when the King and the Prince of Wales had turned their backs, Charles was sending a clear, public message to Buckingham Palace. He was declaring that while the House of Windsor might have abandoned Diana's son, the House of Spencer never would. He was telling King Charles that the Spencer family would not allow Diana's younger son to be isolated and broken, especially not by the same institutional coldness that had claimed his mother. Charles saw the terrifying parallels. He saw Harry being targeted by the media, isolated from his family, and treated as an outcast by the courtiers. He saw the same cold, defensive pragmatism that had locked the gates of Althorpe in 1993 being deployed against a grieving son in the modern era. He recognized the playbook, the leaked stories, the coordinated snubs, and the psychological isolation. It was the exact same system that had driven Diana to the edge, but Charles Spencer was no longer the young, conditioned father who had locked his sister out. He had spent decades carrying the guilt of that refusal. Standing on the steps of St. Paul's, he was finally correcting his past mistake. He was providing the sanctuary of family to the boy he could not save back in 1997. This alliance was not just a passing moment of support. It was a public declaration of a modern Windsor rebellion, one that connected the trauma of his past with the survival of his nephew. He was standing in the gap, refusing to let the palace machine grind down another member of his family. But this act of defiance was only possible because Charles Spencer had undergone his own painful, transformative journey. He had been forced to dismantle the ancestral armor that had protected and imprisoned him since his childhood. It was a journey that took him to the very edge of emotional collapse. A journey that was leading him to a dusty trunk in the archives of Althorpe, where a final, devastating discovery would change how he viewed his entire life. What did Charles Spencer discover inside that dusty trunk of letters written by his 8-year-old self that finally broke his clinical breakdown, allowing him to forgive the mother who abandoned him, reclaiming the boy in the ashes? The path to healing is rarely a smooth, upward trajectory. For Charles Spencer, the emotional armor he had built at Madewell Hall worked perfectly for decades. It kept his pain locked away behind a wall of aristocratic duty. But you cannot suppress trauma forever. You cannot bury the screams of children under the flagstones of a grand estate and expect them to remain silent. Eventually, the dam must burst. In his late 50s, the weight of his sister's death, his failed marriages, and the buried horrors of his school days finally caught up with him. He suffered a severe clinical breakdown, a collapse of the mind that left him unable to function. He checked himself into a residential trauma center. It was a quiet facility where he was stripped of his titles and his status, left only with his raw, unvarnished memories. It was there that he realized he had to stop running from the boy he once was. He had to go back to the beginning, go back to the freezing hallways of Madewell Hall and the silent rooms of Althorpe. He returned to Althorpe, not as the Grand Earl, but as a survivor searching for clues. Charles descended into the archives of his family estate. He kept on searching through the historical records until he found a dusty, long-forgotten trunk of family correspondence. Inside lay a bundle of letters written in the faded, uneven handwriting of an 8-year-old child. They were the letters he had written to his mother, Frances, during his first term at Madewell Hall in 1972. As Charles untied the ribbon and read those words, the final devastating truth of his childhood was laid bare. The letters were filled with a desperate, heartbreaking homesickness. He had written to his mother almost every single day. He was begging her to come and rescue him. In the letter, he kept on telling her how much he missed her and described the cold terror of the school. He had begged her to write back, to send him a sign that she still loved him and to tell him when he could come home. But as he searched through the trunk, he made a chilling discovery. The letters had never been sent. They had been intercepted by the school staff, read, and locked away. The letters never reached the grieving mother, who had been accused of abandoning her children. She had been left to believe that her son did not want to write to her, while he had been left to believe that she did not care enough to answer. The realization broke through his clinical breakdown like a wave of pure light. For nearly 50 years, Charles had carried a deep, subconscious belief that he had been sent away because he was unloved, that his mother's departure was his fault, and that he was fundamentally broken. The discovery of those letters proved the absolute opposite. It showed that he was just an innocent, loving child who had been systematically isolated by a cruel and abusive system. It was not his fault, or his mother's fault. They had both been victims of an antiquated, aristocratic conditioning that prioritized cold detachment over human love. With that realization, the ancestral armor Charles had carried for decades finally crumbled into ash. He was able to forgive his mother and himself for locking the gates against Diana in 1993. By writing his raw, uncompromising memoir, A Very Private School, Charles Spencer delivered a final, undeniable truth that left the British establishment reeling. He broke the code of absolute defensive silence that had ruled his family for generations. He saved the boy he once was, and in doing so, he honored the sister he could not save. The cycle of cold, royal detachment stops here. Charles Spencer chose to break the silence. He saved the boy he once was, and in doing so, he honored the sister he could not save. The cycle of cold royal detachment stops here. But what do you think? Did Charles make the right choice by finally exposing these palace secrets? And is he right to stand with Prince Harry against the royal machine today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this deep dive touched your heart, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from behind the palace gates. Thank you for watching.